Welcome back to Rebuilders. My name is Liddy and I'm here with Mark Sayers. How are you, Mark?
I am good. How are you?
Good. Doing pretty well at staving off both you and Daniel's madness.
We have been driven a little bit mad, haven't we? Obviously the lands down under, now New Zealand as well, is in lockdown. There's a little bit of an outlet to see some other people and be stupid.
Been at home for the last week.
Yeah. So as we've been setting up, it's been a bit mad. But now we're serious, as we'll talk about serious things.
Yes. I do appreciate the madness. I think it's a great coping strategy. What we are thankful for is that we can come in and record this. So, we are in a privileged position where we have the opportunity to do that. So very thankful for that. Speaking of why we're locked down, we are obviously in a pandemic. Don't know whether you knew that. And we've had a few questions come in, and this one that I'm going to read out comes from an anonymous listener. Why has the pandemic become politicized?
Great question. Well, any historical event always occurs within a historical context. They don't occur in a vacuum. If we look at the first pandemic that people sort of, I guess, would know about historically, and which was referred to a lot when COVID-19 kicked off, is the Spanish flu, which occurred at the beginning of the 20th century. And the historical context for that was at the end of the Great War, the First World War. It's interesting, the name, the Spanish flu, in a sense, is quite unfair on Spain because it didn't originate in Spain. The reason it's called the Spanish flu is that Spain was not involved in the war.
Okay.
It remained neutral. And therefore, they didn't have to protect morale of troops or populations who'd gone through the war. So they just started reporting on what was actually happening, which was that people were getting this really deadly flu and their newspapers. So what was happening with a lot of the other powers that were involved in the First World War is that they weren't reporting on it. So the Germans and the English and so on were not reporting on what was happening. We now know that, there's a few, I think, candidates of where the Spanish flu originated, but it wasn't Spain.
Okay.
What then happened was that the Spanish flu went around the world because it came at the end of the war, and you can imagine the terrible, terrible sanitary conditions in the trench warfare that we saw, particularly on the Western Front. And then with the troops returning home, they took it. You had troops all over the world in the First World War, from colonial troops and which went back everywhere, and they took the then flu across the world in this huge movement of people. So that shows us how things like pandemics, they don't operate in a vacuum. Now, COVID-19 breaks out. Really. Depends, on what we will find out as we get to the origins, either at the beginning of 2020 or the end of 2019. And it breaks out with a couple of contexts. The first context is that it breaks out in the midst of escalating trade war between the United States and China.
Okay.
And also not just a trade war, but really one of those sort of, moments where you have a global superpower, you have a centralized power of the day, and you have a rising power meeting it. And obviously you've got the United States as the central power of the day, and then you've got China, which is rising. So there's this tremendous competition between the two economically, in terms of information and cyber warfare and all these things. So they're not in a physical war, but there's a sense of great competition. They call it great power competition. So the arrival of COVID-19 gets played into that context. And this is where some of the, you see some of the arguments around the World Health Organization's probe into the origins of COVID, and people are like, can you trust what's coming out of China? Then you got the Chinese saying that actually, COVID came to, China because of the World Army Games, and they're trying to trace it back to the origins at Fort Detrick, which is sort of the center of US biological weapons programs. So you've got all of that is going on. So you've had this tremendous sort of, confusing and muddying of the waters because of that great power competition. So that's at a macro scale. The second level is then it comes into the United States, and you've got a culture war that's occurring in the United States. You've got this moment of tremendous political polarization in the United States, which has been there through a lot of American history, but particularly I think has really reached a fever pitch, particularly with the election of Donald Trump. And you've got this America divided into Republicans and Democrats, liberals and progressives. In many ways, that's become almost the organizing principal story, which Americans uses 2 containers to process anything.
Yep.
Now, what's really interesting about COVID is, and following it from really early on, is that it's actually almost people who are taking COVID seriously have almost swapped sides on different times.
Yes.
So when the virus first came, it was really interesting. It was actually sort of there was a number of like Silicon Valley types, but there was people like Steve Bannon and stuff like that who were actually because President Trump was pushing back on China and having this trade war. People saw it as evidence that actually, using it is sort of as part of that. So it was almost like the first iteration of it in the American political scene was like, this is a way, look, China's doing this, look what's going on there, they're hiding this, we need to protect ourselves from it. And what's really interesting too is that, the sort of Trumpian doctrine of, build a wall, keep the world out, having then these sort of quarantine measures where you actually want to shut out what was going on in China. So it was really interesting. That was sort of the first iteration. And then you actually had, if you go back and look at the historical record, it was processed. So early on, it was almost sort of Republicans wanting to take COVID seriously and Democrats not. So there's actually this fascinating, like you can go look at an internet Wayback Machine of like, I think it's Vox and stuff like this, had these articles like almost like, don't get worried about coronavirus. It's this big blow up that the Republicans are doing because they want to keep China out and they want to keep foreigners out. And because early on too, a lot of the calls were to quarantine nations and to shut borders. People then took that as part of the overall discussion that had already been happening around immigration. And seeing Donald Trump, who wanted to control immigration, build a wall, et cetera, people then interpreted it in that, which is fascinating. And there's early tweets where there were people saying, don't go to Chinatown celebrations in San Francisco. And there's a Democrat, I think it was the mayor or something, put up a thing saying, no, it's perfectly safe to go to this event, and you're almost a bit racist if you don't want to go to these events and you're afraid of this, and it's just the flu. So it's interesting. The just the flu thing at first was coming from Democrats. But then it begins to change.
Yeah.
And I think it begins to sort of hit that sort of almost then the Republican sort of idea of, personal, libertarianism and personal freedom. Obviously, as a pandemic then gets more serious, it actually, you have to curtail some of your freedoms to deal with it and you have a collective response. So then it sort of flips again. And then you sort of have this slow change where you've got Democrats sort of seeing that, oh, hang on, this is actually a public health issue. It sort of then more moves into the things that traditionally people on the left are more interested in, collectivism, good public health response, government response, and so on, versus individualism. And then it flips again. So it then moves to more the Republicans not wanting to take it as serious or, like pushing back on it, and the sort of Democrats making it more serious. But then again, it flips again when you had sort of obviously with the death of George Floyd, and you have these sort of protest movements, and then you start to hear people on the right like, oh, why are they all gathering in the streets? This is just going to spread coronavirus. And then people saying, oh, no, it's fine. It's okay outdoors. And so you've actually, if you watch for a period, probably the first 6 months, it was going backwards and forwards for a little period there. And even you've seen stuff, like it's funny on Twitter, people put up images of like, there's people who've gone like, oh, this is perfectly safe, this protest march, but this Trump rally's bad, and vice versa. People going, this Trump rally's safe, but this protest march is bad. So what you see is that in many ways, the politicization of coronavirus, which is now seeped out around the world. So the other thing you got to realize is you've got this American culture war, which wants to put everything into a container.
Yes.
As a way of understanding an increasingly complex world.
Yeah.
And we've spoken about
which
that
we
before.
kind of do as humans anyway.
Yes.
Yeah, to understand things.
Yeah. So it becomes a way of, I don't know what that is this new phenomenon. And even things like Bitcoin now, it's interesting, like Bitcoin's in this really, and cryptocurrencies, it's this really moment where you can see where's it going to land, and it's sort of almost landing. There's some pushback, sort of on the left a little bit to some of it, but then there's people on the left who still like it, and so on. Really interesting. It will eventually land in one of these things, but it's sort of short circuiting it at the moment. So you've got this American culture war, and which has gotten more polarized. There's some Pew just did a sort of global study, and it came out that America's become even more polarized throughout COVID. Interestingly, Australia and New Zealand have become less polarized, which is fascinating. And you've then got, because America's sort of got this hegemonic control over mass media and entertainment, and increasingly as local newspapers around the world have sort of dropped off, plus the influence of the internet, what that means is that culture war then is exported. So, places like Canada, which would sort of have their own political culture, and they still do, and it's, very, different to the United States, but you see it bleeding into other places. And you've even seen it here. So even at some of the protests that we've, had against some of the coronavirus restriction stuff, there's people carrying American flags, there's people carrying the Tea Party flags, which is fascinating, and Trump hats and stuff like that. So in some sense, because America is in a sense is like an idea, and, we're sort of in this American century of globalization, it means that culture war goes out. So you've got a bunch of people who are processing something through an American cultural lens. Now, whether you're in America or you're outside of America, I think that container of trying to put everything in those two buckets is an increasingly failed way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
And, I think one of the worst ways to see what's happening in the world is to try and look at it through the lens of domestic American politics. And so, that's really the reason why. Now, also, there's some other politicization, some of the politicization that we've seen around things like vaccines between Pfizer and AstraZeneca. Part of that played out, I think, around Brexit. So, you had AstraZeneca, which was really sort of, come out of Britain, and Britain was, very rapidly vaccinating.
Yeah, this is just at a local level here in Australia that you're referring to.
Yeah, so... here in Australia, you've had this debate of do you get AstraZeneca, do you get Pfizer? Some of that is this play out of what was happening in Europe, where Europe was sort of more using Pfizer, didn't want to use AstraZeneca. And, there was even like reports then banning AstraZeneca in certain European countries. So you see these you've also got another, so this comes under the rubric really of vaccine nationalism. You've got Sinovac, which is the Chinese vaccine. So certain countries which have, been caught, do we go with the sort of more Western ones, or we might go with the Chinese ones? So all of this plays out in the background of politicization of a pandemic because of the existing fractures and tensions already existing in the world.
Yeah. And I mean, this is highlighted for so many of our listeners in their church contexts. So having that understanding of where that politicization of what is a public health crisis is really helpful in addressing your congregations and the people that you lead, depending on what your context is. Still on that same path of the American century, so to speak, we had a question come in that basically, it's more of a statement. I like it. Thank you, Gary. Jesus and John Wayne discuss.
Okay. Okay, so this is referring to a really popular book which has come out recently. The author's name temporarily escapes me.
Dumas?
You can Google away.
Dumas, I think it is.
And effectively is really we get our fact checkers rapidly typing.
I mean, I should just leave Daniel to it. He's on the computer.
Christine Corbez-Dumas.
And she's written a book which is really, I guess, having a look at particularly, let's call it an archetype of masculinity that you find in American culture, epitomized by John Wayne, the Hollywood actor who, played for many years, primarily cowboy characters, but some others. And, I think she's asking the questions of, how has that affected even how within the American evangelical subculture has affected views of masculinity with the American evangelical subculture. Really interesting at school, at high school here in Australia. I remember in year 11, I think it was, second last year of high school, we looked at the classic sort of movie, The Green Berets, with John Wayne, which is very much this sort of propaganda movie, which John Wayne, I think he financed it, or he very much pushed that movie. And really what it was about the Green Berets, and it was trying to argue for, the just cause of American involvement in the Vietnam War. And, it's a classic example of almost that sort of, American figure and almost what I would call a frontier figure. Richard Slot can come up, I don't know if he's the first one to coin it, but talked about the sort of myth of the frontier, which is the idea that as America became a more industrial society, there was this sense that people felt that there was something being lost in the essence of what it was to be an American, sort of going into this new world frontier. And the myth of the frontier began to sort of rise in people's minds as the East Coast became more industrialized and in a sense just brought people into this industrial culture of collectivism and the individual sort of got lost in the urban city. This myth of the frontier going westward.
Yeah, we've talked about that before on this podcast.
And so John Wayne is the embodiment of that, the westward, cowboy figure. And it's interesting that it's really popular at the time that, America. So John Wayne, like if you think about the beginning of the American century, really begins after World War II. John Wayne's films are really popular, in the 50s and 60s, and he's that classic, embodiment of that character. Now, there's another really interesting John Wayne movie by John Ford called The Searchers, which is a really fascinating movie. And it's actually sort of, I can't remember the exact year. Can we get a year on that? Is it 58? I'm guessing. I could be wrong. The Searchers, John Ford. And John Ford in that movie, he's actually, it's quite a subversive movie, I think, for the time in the sense that what it does is it brings this character in. John Wayne's playing this character who is trying to rescue this...
56.
This person who's been abducted by... Indigenous Americans and bring back. But then it's like this really interesting thing with the character of John Wayne is almost this untrustworthy character. It seems like he is the good cowboy, but then you start to see this darker side. That really what's sort of driving him is racism, and what he's doing is almost starting to just touch on that idea of the frontier as a complex myth, and which is not just about entrepreneurialism and rugged individualism, but there's actually a price to pay. This is people's lands that are being taken. There's this background of racism, which is touched on in the movie, which is really interesting. And I think this is what's happening, that this book has hit a resonance in the United States in particular, because there's also a bigger question of what an American identity is.
Yes.
I think we've spoken before. I think for some of the ideas around deconstructing some of those imagery, in that book, is not unknown to us.
Yes.
But perhaps in America, it's more central to, that identity. In particular, in the church, there has been this sense at different times. It's really interesting. In the 19th century in Britain, when Britain was at the height of its empire, there was this real sense, and it goes back to a lot of readings in the ancient world about how empires become corrupt. And one of the fears that is an empire reaches its sort of heights, that what that will mean is that original, let's call it the frontier spirit of the empire is lost, that people fought to create this empire and that's lost, and then people become domesticated. And then they become sort of corrupt and sort of effete and over, sophisticated. And that's the fear that they have in the 19th century in the British Empire. And what happens is the idea of beards, which, come in. And I was reading Ben Wilson's book recently about Britain in the 1850s, the historian, and he talks about, beards were, I forgot the name of the book, but beards were like fashionable because it's what colonial soldiers on the front lines of India or in Afghanistan, they were wearing these beards.
Yeah.
And so beards became popular back in London because it was a way of trying to recapture this sense of masculinity. And you saw, there was also this fear, and it's interesting too because Jesus and John Wayne is has this sense that evangelicalism has got this sense of masculinity which needs to be deconstructed. Really interesting. In 19th century England and the UK, it was actually a fear. If you think about what happened, particularly in a British context of evangelicalism, it was this movement which actually empowered women in lots of ways. You had women who then got involved in all kinds of different, look at Methodism and you look at this, there's all these different sort of mediating institutions that women got involved in. If you look at a lot of the origins of the suffragette movement, go back to Methodism. Here in Melbourne, the whole temperance movement was, which came out of Methodism, was actually one of the sort of first iterations of sort of women who were pushing back on domestic violence, which is caused by alcohol. So part of what was going on in Britain at that time was there was a fear over that even evangelicalism and Christianity was making men lose that masculine frontier spirit.
Yeah.
So this movement of, I think it was Charles Kingsley who came up with this, called it muscular Christianity. And there was this reconnection of how do we make the empire have its sort of, muscular power again. And this is where bodybuilding comes in. It was fascinating. Really interesting sidebar. There's also interesting, if you go back to some, even in Judaism, there was this similar thing happened in Europe where there was a sort of this way of actually moving, the sort of Jewish archetype from sort of the intellectual back to sort of like this strong person connected. So this didn't just fall into Christianity, it flew into other spaces as well. So interesting also in South America, there's this sense that people talk about in South America, there's lots of, reflections on how evangelicalism comes and destroys the idea of machoism.
Yeah.
It sort of goes different ways in different places. But I think effectively why this book is I think gaining a lot of readership, yes, it's about masculinity, but I think the bigger story is at sort of the height and potentially the sort of end of the American century. And I'm just very aware of the images that we've seen in the last 24 hours coming out of Kabul and Kabul airport, which, people were initially saying looks like the fall of Saigon in 1976, actually looks worse than that. Just from a complete sort of optics view of like sort of America, leaving, and then you've got the sort of frontiers imagery of the Taliban beards and, we're back in the 19th century.
Yeah, wow.
So, yes, that's a very long answer to that question.
It is, but it's good. Well, just on the Taliban.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Obviously, it is a very live topic at the moment. And quite confronting for many people around the world. What would you have to say about that? How do we as leaders approach this situation?
Well, I think the first point is, obviously a half of what's happening for the people of Afghanistan who have gone through decades and decades. Well, absolutely. I think our Prime Minister said yesterday, we know what tragic history this country has. And so I think, firstly, for anyone listening, how we can respond as the church in just really practical ways, in prayerful ways is, I think, really important. And, at the end of the day, there's the language, there's the saying is that, Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. And I can talk about that in a second. But, first of all, the Afghan people, and having met many Afghan people and known many Afghan people here in Melbourne over the years. And also, I think of, many, Afghan veterans here I've sat with and pastorally cared for both in Australia and spoken to people in the US, for them to go through this and then see what's happening now. It's just I just want to sort of mark that. It's really, really difficult. That statement, Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. We saw, again, Britain in the 19th century, the might of the British Empire at that stage, with all its military power, economic power, outdone by this country, And, the saying back then, I think it was Rudyard Kipling, talked about, the great game that, Afghanistan's almost this plaything between these empires, Britain and Russia and China and India. And, sadly, that same story is playing out. One of the things they say is a country that you don't want to be in is a country that's resource rich but doesn't have good institutions. And Australia, we're really privileged to be in a country that has lots of resources but has strong institutions.
Yeah.
But Afghanistan is a resource-rich country, but has really struggled to build good institutions because it's been a plaything of empires. And obviously, then you had the Soviets come in, and the Soviets left. I think it was 2 or 3 years before, in a sense, the Soviet Empire fell. And obviously, then it's become almost, in a sense, you could also say, sort of a playground of the empire of international jihadism. What we saw leading to September 11th. But I just saw the images yesterday, and I felt like this is a really historical, epochal moment. And I think that in many ways it marks the end of the American century. And what I mean by that, I don't mean the end of America. I think often people hear that and think it's sort of end of America. I think it's really the end of a phase of history that the world has lived through since the end of the Second World War.
Yeah.
And, I think it's also just not just about, you go back to, I remember, I'm old enough to remember when, America First and, we went in, EU, lots of different people went in to Afghanistan, and there were so many op-eds and experts and historians coming on saying, it's the graveyard of empires. No one has conquered Afghanistan, and we're seeing that 20 years later. This is the attempts of humanity to shape history towards their ends, in the sense of, particularly the US administration at the time, and the neoconservative view of the world, that we can go and plant liberal democracy in places and people will just accept it because of the unique rightness of our position. I think the fruit of that is just looks rotten today, and the stories of not just what's happening with, I guess, some of the American incompetence and what it feels like around the planning of the exit, but also, even what we're hearing, some of the way that some of the European nations left,
Yeah.
and I just think we're approaching a sort of moment where, in many ways, the West, on both the left and the right, has preached so many moralities, and people get, you got people like, I'm a bit more conservative, I'm a bit more on the left, or people complaining about the woke thing, or people complaining about this neoconservative liberal democracy version. All of it, under the banner of the West, has fallen short at this point of time. And I look at these moments and, I just think of, the scriptures saying that, history groans, creation groans. And I think it's just one of those moments where, we need Jesus to come and we need his kingdom to break out in this world. And, for the people who are believers in Afghanistan, and I saw some messages early this morning of churches and believers have had to go underground, we pray for them. We pray for the people of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
This is a tragic reminder that humans cannot reshape the world. Even the West, when we're trying to do it with our best moral clothing on, we fall short. And, like the poor and the innocent get hurt. So it's a tragedy.
Yeah. Thank you for your reflection on that. I'm going to take a little bit of a different direction.
Yeah.
Got a question from Mike. A lot of church leaders seem concerned about critical theory and its derivatives as the key modern danger to orthodoxy. What do you think are the cultural trends in thinking we should be most watching out for?
Wow.
You've just been waiting to answer a critical theory question.
Wow, we're hitting it all today, man. Everything, all the big issues.
Yeah.
Okay, so confession, I've had more people send me messages about critical theory in the last 12 months than any other question. And the secondary thing, Mike's secondary point there is derivatives, which I think in some ways sort of a subset. I'll sort of do a quick sketch of critical theory in a second, but sort of subset of that, particularly again in the United States around critical race theory, which is applying some of the ideas of critical theory to particularly issues of race. So, back of a postage stamp sketch of critical theory really is, a set of philosophical, sociological beliefs that emerge, in the mid-century, particularly in France, but at the Frankfurt School, also in Germany, which really, I guess, takes a sort of critical view of culture, sees culture as something sort of sense to be interpreted, and particularly is really interested in looking at how power manifests in culture.
Yeah.
And, I'll pause there because the reason I have not addressed this any earlier, despite having every man and their dog wanting me to do a joint episode.
Have developed opposable thumbs so that they can type those messages to you.
We get some amazing questions from dogs. If you just listen to them.
Particularly Stalin's dog.
Stalin's dog, yeah. That's for the listeners of last week. We'll recognise that joke. Okay, so the reason I have avoided talking about critical theory, despite every man and their dog asking me to, is we're in such a weird time that I believe you can't deal with ideas in their purest form. Okay, what do I mean by this? I think there is this thing that Western culture has seen itself as this battleground of ideas, and that ideas change the world. And I think lots of people in the church have taken that as well. And, that if we can just understand the worldview of this, or we can just understand that idea, or if that idea gets out, it's going to change things. And there is truth in that. There's no doubt that ideas shape the world. one of the things that we've spoken about on this podcast is that we've moved from a complicated world to a complex world.
Yep.
In a complex world, there is so much more going on. And a complex world operates by a completely different set of rules to a complicated world.
Yeah.
So I think everyone's looking at this through a complicated world lens, which is, what are the beliefs of critical theory? Here they are. People trace it back to Marxism and the structural analysis of Marxism and materialistic, materialist dialectics and all this sort of stuff, And so if we were going to do the complicated world answer to this, I would go, here is Herbert Marcuse and here is the Frankfurt School and here is Michel Foucault and here's the 22 things they believe and this is how it links up to this and so on. But it's just, we're in a complex world, and I look at everything and I look at everything now and it's utterly bonkers. Okay, what do I mean by this? So if I was just to do that, it would not touch on the absolute weirdness of this moment. Okay, so what do I mean by that?
What do you mean by that?
We have currently, we just spoke about before, we have a great power competition between America and China.
Yep.
China, what is China? China, it calls itself a communist country. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's a communist country. So if we were just going to look at the idea, if we're just going to look at that and say, okay, we're dealing with a communist regime, they must be therefore Marxist-Leninists who believe this. Okay, so the elites who run China, the Politburo, if you showed them to Marx and Lenin or Stalin, they would just be like, who on earth are these people? Mm. You have this leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, who many of them have like Bentleys and kids who are educated at Ivy League colleges and Oxford. Like, you've got this like group of people who call themselves in communist in name only, yet who operate in this completely contrary, weird, complex world, upside down, inside out reality. Completely bizarre. You have this bizarre moment where France, which is the country which, in a sense, spawned much of critical theory. Emmanuel Macron, who during Donald Trump's presidency was lauded as sort of the liberal centrist saviour of the world, currently talks about Islam and immigration, and his ministers talk about these things in a way which is to the right of Donald Trump. The guy who's meant to be the liberal centrist and who prides himself on sort of the centrist liberalism of the French Republic and, liberté, égalité, fraternity, actually, has got a program where he's actually trying to push back. The French government is trying to push back on what they call woke American ideas. Mm-hmm. Like, this is totally bizarre. The other weird thing is you've got people in America who are conservatives who are up in arms about critical theory, who are acting like critical theorists. So the critical theory is this reading of culture, seeing that there's this hidden power in culture, that there's this malevolent forces behind bureaucracy, that government is here to control us. Michel Foucault talked about, biopower, that the state and government would use like sort of almost the language of medicalization in a sense to control people. So the people who are worried about that at this point in time, the people who are pushing back on critical theory actually are acting like critical theorists. The people who are pushing back on things like Michel Foucault are actually then worried about masks and vaccines and actually sound like me to Michel Foucault. Sound like Michel Foucault to me.
Yeah.
So part of me is like, okay, I'm happy to talk about this. I'm happy to talk about critical theory, but I don't think that's what's actually going on. Now, okay, to understand this, Ulrich Beck, the German sociologist, talked about zombie categories. Mm-hmm. And he talked about modernity will get to this stage where you've got these categories of thought that people are talking about and they're acting like they're real, and institutions like they're acting like they're real, yet they're a hollow shell of themselves. So again, to go back to this moment, this is such a strange moment because, again, if you were to go to that first generation of critical theorists and Herbert Marcuse and all these people and show them the fact that some of the biggest corporations of our day are like McDonald's, are like doing ads. Like I saw a McDonald's a thing on Twitter about advocating for it was black trans lives. Now, if you'd shown that to Michel Foucault, that this corporation, which is responsible for so many different environmental things in the world, or even crazier, Raytheon, the world's biggest weapons producer, intimately linked to the industrial military complex of the United States, that they are now talking in the language of critical theory. This is, to me, this is something bigger is going on than just the problem of critical theory. Okay, so I'm sounding very passionate here. It's not. This is not passionate. This is more I feel like no one is getting how strange this moment is, and there's something weirder going on than critical theory. And I think what's happening is, again, in a complex world, the network, in a sense, it turns things into zombie categories. So I feel like most of the commentary around this is missing out on the fact that there's a dynamic that everyone's missing. Like, what is going on in the world? The fact that you've got now conservatives who sound like postmodernists, you've got supposedly leftists who are speaking like the critical theorists but now sound like the powers that the critical theorists were trying to undermine. The fact that, one of the big things of critical theory, and you can take this even back to Walter Benjamin and all these sort of people, was, they felt there was this bureaucratization of life, that what was going to happen is the modern world was going to create this giant bureaucracy that was going to stifle and even people like, Alexander Kojev, talk about like that would turn us into insects, so this, and this was the fear. But so the people who are using the language of critical theory are also part of the bureaucratic class. Like, this has been spread through human relations departments, and all these different things. Like the main spreader of so much of this thought today is human relations departments. It's like teachers, education departments. It's just so strange. So pardon me, if you hear my exasperation, there is something far more weirder going on. I've not heard many good takes on what is happening. I think this is the bigger thing for me is, how can we I think there's these ideologies wandering around at the moment that people are trying to put over the new dynamics of a complex network world, and they don't fit.
Does it come back to what you were talking about before about the left and the right in America, and I guess globally in a way as well, that we want to be able to put things in boxes and understand them. And so there's this framework that was developed, centuries and centuries ago. And we're like, well, maybe we can use this to help understand what's going on. People just want to know what's going on, right?
Yeah, and it becomes a lazy hermeneutic of understanding the world, And I do think what's happened is, like, I hear some of the push. So I do hear the people saying, is there a problem with, does critical theory have flaws? Absolutely. Does capitalist theory have flaws? Absolutely. Does libertarianism have flaws? Absolutely. Does centrism have flaws? Absolutely. What we're seeing in Afghanistan now, what we saw in the global financial crisis, was supposedly the centrists. This is the centrists failing. I see that part of the reason, and maybe I've just been fortunate enough to grow up in a place like Melbourne where I've been around evangelicals who also then had a strong biblical prophetic critique of the culture. I think people like John Smith and people who I've grown up around who I think part of the reason this is happening in certain places that they're seeing, go back one step. Martin Lloyd-Jones wrote a book, From Fear to Faith, in maybe 1953. And he said something really interesting. At that time, the world and the church had come out of World War II. They were traumatized, and they were worrying about the rise of communism in the world. There was, Reds under the bed, the Red Scare. This was all across the world. And he said, what if we're looking this the wrong way? What if, yes, there's promise with communism, but actually what if God is using this to show how we've been deficient?
Yeah.
And what if actually at this moment, the fear around critical theory, and look, again, I see all the problems with it. A lot of what I spoke about in this cultural moment was a critique of some of that stuff. So I have a critique, absolutely. But I have an equal critique of what I've heard on the right as well. And I wonder what has actually happened is, particularly in the evangelical church and many parts of the Catholic Church, and there's Catholics who listen to this as well, we let go of the biblical prophetic witness that is in the scriptures. The scriptures have their own critical theory of how human structures fall short of the glory of God, how human structures will inevitably trend, whatever they look like, whatever nation they were, whether Egyptian, Babylonian, or at times Israel. And I believe that whether it's a liberal democracy, a monarchy, a libertarian, a communist, a socialist, a Swedish democratic socialist, whatever, an Australian Liberal Party or Labor Party, all of these things fall short of the glory of God. Am I saying don't get involved in politics? No. But I think we need to get it back in its right order, where we are devoted and pressing into God and his biblical vision for the world, and really cynical about politics.
Yeah, okay.
Because, so I'm not saying don't get involved. Get involved in your local community. If you need to serve in politics, do that. But let's get cynical about some of these ideologies, because in many ways, part of secularization was ideologies replaced theology. And so that's where I'm at the moment. I see some of this stuff. I see now that, people are talking about, critical race theory, but really they just don't want to have a conversation about race. And so I think there is a biblical thing here where the scriptures call us back to justice and righteousness that flows from God, not from a human construction. And every ideology, let me just put it this way, this is what happens when you lock me up. If you have an ideology, have you ever been to a rally? I remember you go to these youth rallies and they have the altar call and there's the music and you're feeling this pressure and the Spirit's moving and it's an altar call and you're like, oh man, I feel convicted, I need to go. Right, and maybe you're sitting next to someone and you can see they're convicted and you would go down with your mate to the front and you'd pray with them. Okay, if you've got an ideology, if you're a conservative, if you see yourself on the left, if you're a libertarian, whatever the heck you see yourself, take your ideology to the front of the altar and let it come under the judgment of God, and then see what are the parts that are from humans and let them stay at the front of the altar, and whatever reflects the wisdom and goodness of God, let it get up with you and come back to the seats. Let's baptize our ideologies.
Whew. Great. Thank you for, for that answer. I wonder if you can sort of expand on this a little bit more, even though that was expansive. You did this Instagram post last week where you talked about nature.
Ah, yes.
Can you catch people up on that and maybe explore it in the context of critical theory as well?
Yeah. Look, okay, so one of the things of the modern world, and all these ideologies come out of the modern world. If you look at the Enlightenment, all of these things from left-wing, right-wing, all of them, capitalism, socialism, all of these are Western-based solutions that emerge. They've affected the whole world, but predominantly come out of the West and predominantly come out of the Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. One of these sort of tenets of the Enlightenment was, if you think before the Enlightenment, humans felt at the mercy of nature.
Yes.
And nature is this wild, awe-struck thing, that humans feel very weak in front of.
Yeah.
And a storm,
bushfires,
you name it. And part of the rise of science was this sense that what humans had done was, in a sense, tame but then conquer nature. So first it's we tame it, we understand it, we understand the rules of the universe, what is the Newtonian universe, and how do we understand those rules? And that then enables it. So first we understood it, tamed it, and then you think the age of conquest and exploration and all this is humans going out into the wild. Again, we're back at the frontier myth.
I was about
back
to say,
the frontier myth.
Here we are, John Wayne again.
And the explorer who goes on the high seas, and then you think about where does all this exploration go? You've got people going to tap oil and dig gold out of the ground, and it's this we can take from the earth what is ours and conquer nature, which then furnishes this world of growth and the modern world. So there's an expectation the average 21st century developed world person in a sense thinks they've beaten nature. And it's interesting, nature changes. Mary Antoinette, before the French Revolution, as this aristocrat, had a little garden in her palace and she'd go and pretend she was a shepherdess. But in a sense, that's what every modern person does. We have our urban living in our city. We can drive our cars and we expect all the infrastructure to work. And then we'll go and have a little holiday, rustic retreat and, go to nature, or we walk around the botanical gardens. And in a sense, this is a sign that we've conquered nature. Now,
again, if you've seen my backyard, you'll know that we haven't conquered nature.
Almost there. You could if you wanted to. But it's really interesting too, because again this comes back to, Genesis, and this comes back to the sense that we're trying to create Edens. And, Cain, after he murders his brother, the scriptures tell us, wanders east of Eden. I find that verse fascinating. And, Jacques Ellul in his book, The Meaning of the City, focused on that. And he sort of says, in a sense, the first building of the first city, in a sense, is his alternate to the Garden of Eden. We're kicked out of the Garden of Eden. We're kicked out of the presence of God. So we try and create our gardens. In a sense, our gardens reflect that. So there's a good part of that. There's a sense that we're called to be shoma, stewards of creation. But then when we try and do that without the Holy Spirit, without the presence of God, not under the rule and reign of Jesus, that it goes bad. So the modern project is an attempt to build Eden, to build the garden city without God, who's at the center of the garden city.
Yeah.
And so I think what's happening at the moment is most of our political solutions of the Enlightenment, whether, again, socialism, left, right, libertarianism, even our ideas around equality, all of this come from an idea that, we don't need to worry about nature now. We can just work on human nature. We've tamed and conquered nature. Now we're going to tame and conquer and manage human nature. And then you have a pandemic. And these tiny little replicating cells, however it emerged in Wuhan, which I'm sure we'll find out in time, this tiny little thing, so small, actually brings down the giant managed global garden city that we're trying to build of globalization. And, not only that, you look at the report that the UN put out, I think it was a week ago, of, Code Red for humanity. We are seeing temperatures being reached in the Arctic Circle we've never seen before. The hottest days on record. I'm not going to go into all of that, but I do believe that also what's partially, we go back to the culture war, put it in a bucket. We've done that with environment. But the world is facing tremendous challenges again from nature, from climate change, from pollution, from pandemics. And what a lot of people don't know is, people talk about you have a once in 100-year pandemic. As humans push into the natural environment, you have more chance of pandemics, more chance of environmental damage is going to create more pandemics.
Yeah, okay.
So all of a sudden, we are facing the challenges of a pandemic, and we're trying to answer that with the political answers that were designed for the age of human nature. Freedom. Freedom. A cell does not give a stuff about your freedom. Coronavirus is not sitting there going, I'm really trampling on some civil liberties here, and the Declaration of human rights. Like it doesn't care. Climate change is not going to care about that. So again, am I saying that freedom's not important? No. Am I saying that human rights is not important? No. Am I saying that all the political things that the West has created and come out of the Enlightenment is not important? No. I'm happy to live in a really well-functioning liberal democracy like Australia. But what I'm saying is we're facing the return of nature.
Yes.
And there is an opportunity here, because I think what's going to happen is increasingly many of the ways that we've understood the world are actually being short-circuited. And therefore, what that means is there is an evangelistic opportunity. Again, Joe, I've said this multiple times on this podcast. George Hunter said, look for the gaps between idols. We're coming at this age where nature is returning. And one of the things that people have often said is that, secularization is linked to urbanization.
Yep.
We've talked before here about Ronald Englehart's theory that people get into issues of what he calls post-materialist values when they're not worried about their safety. So all these questions are around identity and so many things that people are concerned about, the issues of critical theory, they're all actually based on the fact that they're the questions that people ask in very affluent, functioning, competent societies.
Safe. Yeah.
We're looking at, you're going to see increased interruptions to the global supply chain. You're going to see stuff that you expected would always be there that's not going to be there through challenges, through things like pandemics and the environment and so on. So there's going to be an evangelistic opportunity that we need to be attuned to. And I think we need as leaders also ask the question, or Christians just full stop, or human beings, how have we bought into the myths of the garden city without God, of globalization in the 21st century?
That is a big question to reflect on. I'm just going to throw it out there. We can revisit that in another episode. I think that would be really good to explore. Final question.
Yes.
I know that you've had a number of questions from connections you have overseas, wondering what on earth is going on in Australia and New Zealand with our more unique approach to suppressing the coronavirus pandemic?
Yes, great question. Well, again, all this sort of, it's funny. There's all these disparate questions, but they all sort of link today. And I'm very aware, yes, I know Fox News in the US is like currently relaying, news conferences from our, friends in New Zealand,
Premier,
Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, and our state premier here, Daniel Andrews, and so on, and sort of as evidence of some sort of, emerging Orwellian totalitarian regime in Australia. Again, too, part of that goes back into what we were just talking about, trying to process a pandemic through, political categories that are important, but may not link to nature in the same way.
Yes.
Okay, so Australia and New Zealand view the world very differently. So the quick Australia-New Zealand thing, and actually this works well because we can bounce it off.
Well, we see everything upside down, right?
Yes, exactly. So it's back to front, upside down. Or is just the rest of the world upside down? I think so. So currently where we're in, there's significant restrictions in New South Wales, the state above us. We're in restrictions, Canberra's in restrictions, and the whole of New Zealand's currently in restrictions. And they're much higher than other places of the world. Why is this so? Why has Australia and New Zealand approached things through a COVID zero? So I'm not going to argue here as this is the right way to do things. I'm just going to explain this is how Australia and New Zealand do it. Again, why? Because it goes into the historical context of the kind of nations that we are in. And Daniel just put a notebook, and we thought that he was like signalling us, but he just simply put a notebook up.
No, I think he was signalling us.
Oh.
You're right. Keep going.
Okay, we'll keep going. Okay.
We'll find out what it was later.
We'll find out afterwards. Okay, so Australia and New Zealand have a very different historical view of the world than Europe and America. Mm-hmm. Again, we talked about the frontier myth. And the frontier myth is this idea that you can go into the frontier and you sort of discover yourself. That was very much the New World idea of the United States. And that in a sense that the individual could escape the constricting confines of the collective, and particularly because America went through a war of independence, it pushed back against British rule. Mm-hmm. What's really different about Australia and New Zealand, and I realise I am speaking on behalf of my Kiwi brethren and sisterin, is that a word? But yeah, so
I'm going to look that up. No, you keep going.
But what's really the thing? Australia and New Zealand, the Queen is our monarch. We never had a rebellion. So we see the crown. Well, we had some rebellion, but we never had the big rebellion. Okay, so we see, in a sense, the Queen differently. And it's really interesting too that essentially what this means is we were a collection of colonies. New Zealand was, going to possibly be a part of what became a federation. So Australia as a nation became a nation in 1901 when the different colonies joined together and decided that what the government was going to do, we needed a federal government in order to protect us militarily.
Yep.
So we have a very different view of the government. We're not like in America. You look at the whole host of popular culture, there's often this sort of the government is watching you somewhere. And even you have people like, we just saw where, we did our Capitol riot episode, where in a sense what you had was even the president will posit himself against the government at times.
Yes. Yes.
So the legislature. Mm-hmm. Now that differentiation is not in Australia. We have this idea of the Queen who's far away, who's sort of almost this benevolent power. But we will look to our government actually to protect us. Mm. Now, what's really interesting too is like Australia and New Zealand, if you look at how it begins as colonies, and what you have is this sort of British or English infrastructure come out and they create this bureaucracy to try and make stuff run really well. So you've got, particularly in Australia, you've got us hugging the shoreline. And, we don't venture out into the centre of Australia. We actually fear the wilderness. We don't want to go to the wilderness. We maybe want to see a bit of nature, but there's this fear that the middle of Australia, there's nothing there. It's actually this scary place. If you look at the history of Australian cinema...
I'm so glad you went there. That's exactly what I was thinking. Go on.
Yeah, often the city is the place, you think of everything from... there's that welcome to Whoop Whoop or something. Mad Max even. Mad Max is like... The actual frontier for Australia is a dangerous place with twisted people. That's actually frightening. And even some of the history of racism in Australia, it's almost like Aboriginal people are seen as, well, they're the people from that central place that's scary and almost become figures of sort of fear.
Yes.
And so you've got then this sort of English bureaucratic, well-run cities that then hug the coastline.
Yeah.
And so Australians want to hug the coastline. We don't want to go and find ourselves in the centre of the frontier because you're going to die there. That's the. And even I remember it was fascinating. Like I remember seeing this thing about Australians buying 4-wheel drives, and there's a Frenchman marketer advertiser called Clotilde Rapai, and he basically he does these sort of group focuses where he comes up what is the cultural one code word to explain a culture. And his one for Australia is survival. And his idea is that Australians there was this classic ad years ago. It was like, suburban Australia, manicured lawns, and this mum goes out in her 4-wheel drive SUV, and then all of a sudden the road transforms and she's in the outback and there's snakes attacking her car.
I remember that.
Yeah. So it's this feel like you live in one of the most peaceful, functioning urban environment. I mean, I don't know if people know this, but Australia, I think, is the most urbanized country in the world. So you live in this really well-run urbanized country, but at any moment you could be plunged into the outback and you could die. You need protection.
Yeah.
So we see the government as protecting us.
Yeah.
So what that means is the second thing is Australia and New Zealand has this thing that we can cut ourselves off from the world because we're islands, and we actually don't just want to protect ourselves from the outback. We want to protect. Well, I know New Zealand's a bit different. You've got the sort of rolling hills in New Zealand, sort of Middle Earth. Okay, but I think that Australia and New Zealand do have in common is that we can then shut the border and protect ourselves from the world. So that's what happened when the pandemic began. Australia and New Zealand, we're just going to shut ourselves off from the global system. And even though Australia and New Zealand, I find my joke is I go and speak places around the world, like, is there an Aussie or a Kiwi here? There almost always is, no matter where I go in the world. Yeah. Love traveling, but happy to surrender that for this period of time to protect ourselves from the outer world. So in a sense, that's what our governments have done. So I think what our governments did was had a sort of really, and again too, for people who are listening overseas and worrying that we've headed into a left-wing totalitarian dictatorship, we have a national cabinet. So our Prime Minister, who is an evangelical, social conservative member of our Conservative Party, has passed this rule that we will go to hard lockdowns to get our numbers right down to get to COVID zero. And part of that as well is I think Australia is more, and we talked about this before, but whereas America looks at freedom, Australia more looks at safety. And I'd say the same with New Zealand. So, New Zealand's had one case that I think went to 4 today, and Jacinda Ardern has locked the country down. That's what our state has done as well. That's what Canberra is doing, and different states, conservative. So going beyond the left and right thing here, even though we get a little bit of wash from some of the American internet stuff, and there is some voices which, sort of talk in that language, it's a very different way of looking at the world, which says we don't want to lose a single life. It's very much, our state has a goal that no one dies on the road. So Australia trends much more towards safety. So that explains our thing. And I think what a lot of people don't know is that actually from the opinion polls, people, in a sense, want to have that approach. Our in West Australia, which is our furthest west state, Mark McGowan, the state premier or equivalent of a governor, literally won the last election through doing hard lockdowns, shutting the border, and going hard. He was so successful in his election that the opposition party conceded 48 hours, I think it was, before. So So in Australia and New Zealand, if you want to have political competency, you need to keep cases down. You need to protect people from COVID. And the economy actually has performed well in Australia and New Zealand, compared, with all of this happening, compared to what's happening in the rest of the world. So that's why Australians and New Zealanders look this completely differently. We actually, in a sense, that I know not everyone's, there's dissenting voices in the midst of this, but it's a very different way of looking at things where people are happy to sacrifice some immediate freedoms.
Yes.
So, we're in a lockdown here. New Zealand's in a lockdown. People are willing to do that and will do it because on the other side, they want to live in a COVID-free reality. Obviously, Delta's presenting a challenge to that, but that's just a quick understanding of why. And so the other final thing is that Australians, I think there is this sort of British thing that Australian New Zealand culture has received to have sort of just like, we'll complain a bit, but then we'll just push through together.
Yeah.
And you don't make a big deal. You don't be an individual. I think we're far more collective. It's more of a sort of like together thing, that we push through.
Yeah. And that togetherness, I guess, is fostered by our physical isolation as well.
Yes.
Well, what a marathon effort.
Wow.
is there any other little tidbits you wanted to?
I think we've hit some big issues today.
Yeah, we really have. Thank you for all of your insights. I for anyone who's interested, I did look up whether
cistern.
Well, I don't.
Well, it's not cistern. That's a whole different thing.
Yeah, that is definitely a different thing. I'm going to need to do some further research on this because cistern is listed here. And it survives in a dialect of which Jamaican is the most.
patois. Yes, that's how I know it.
There you go.
Jamaican dancehall songs, brethren and sister. Yes. There you go.
Amazing. Well, you weren't too far off. So that brings us to the end of our listener questions for the time being.
We're not going to do a tangent on Jamaican dancehall.
Oh, no, write it down. We'll come back to it. Thank you so much for listening today. A reminder, if you want to support us as a podcast and what we do here through Red Church in Melbourne, you can do a number of things. You can rate and review on whatever podcast platform you listen. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can subscribe to our mailing list, which is at our website, rebuilders.co. It'd be great to hear from you. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.